In the untamed wilderness of East Texas, where gnarled pines claw at the endless sky, a whisper of salvation lured the lost and the condemned. From 1845 to 1881, a series of remote camps promised redemption to over 300 souls. But this wasn't a journey to heaven. It was a descent into a waking nightmare. Only a handful ever emerged, their bodies broken, their minds shattered, their voices forever silenced by a terror they couldn't name. They spoke in hushed tones of purification, rituals so gruesome that death itself was a sweet release. In 1881, when federal investigators finally tore down the curtain on these so-called redemption camps, they found something far more chilling than mere religious extremism. A secret graveyard was unearthed, holding the remains of nearly 200 people. Each corpse told a silent story of unimaginable torment. But the true horror was revealed in the private ledgers of the Damnation Family, a criminal enterprise so vast and so meticulously hidden that it had thrived for over 3 decades, preying on the desperate and the damned. Tonight, we peel back the layers on the most successful serial killers in the history of the American frontier and the twisted promise of salvation they sold. But before we continue, let me ask you something. This isn't a story for the faint of heart. It's for those brave enough to confront the darkest truths of American history. If you're one of the few who can stomach what's coming, hit that subscribe button and tell me what state you're listening from. The truth we're about to uncover will shatter everything you thought you knew about faith, justice, and the ultimate price of redemption. The year was 1845. Texas had just become the 28th state, a wild and lawless expanse where escapees from their past sought new lives. The frontier was a crucible of desperation and hope, where a man's honor was as fragile as a handshake, where justice was often found at the end of a rope, and where religious zeal burned hotter than the Texas sun. It was in this unforgiving landscape that whispers began to spread about 3 brothers offering a shocking path to salvation: the purification of the flesh. The Damnation Family, preacher Malachi, evangelist Cornelius, and prophet Jebodiah, had arrived from Arkansas in early 1845, carrying letters of recommendation that painted a picture of righteous men of God. Preacher Malachi Damnation stood 6 feet tall, his piercing gray eyes seeming to peer into a person's very soul. His voice held an unearthly power that could make hardened outlaws weep. At 35, he was the eldest and the most charismatic of the 3, capable of delivering sermons that left his audiences trembling in a state of terror and awe. His younger brother, evangelist Cornelius, possessed a chilling ability to see the guilt etched on a person's face. He could pinpoint a man's darkest sins. The architects of agony. The youngest brother, prophet Jebodiah, was a man of brute force and twisted faith. Built like a blacksmith with massive hands he claimed were blessed with healing powers, his role was to oversee the physical aspects of the purification. He was the enforcer, ensuring each sinner received a level of torment perfectly matched to their transgressions. Together, the Damnation brothers wove a sinister web across the most desolate stretches of East Texas, where cypress swamps met pine forests and civilization was a forgotten dream. Their camps appeared humble from the outside, with canvas tents arranged in perfect circles around a central fire pit where they would preach to desperate souls. Their flock was a gallery of the lost. Cowboys fleeing rustling charges, prostitutes seeking escape, gamblers drowning in debt, murderers running from vigilante justice, and deserters from the Mexican War and various Indian conflicts. But a more unsettling group also sought their salvation. Merchants guilty of fraud, politicians caught in corruption scandals, and even legitimate spiritual seekers lured by the brothers' reputation for miraculous transformations. A gospel of pain. The Damnation brothers preached a harsh gospel perfectly suited to the brutal nature of the frontier. Malachi's voice would thunder through the pines, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. Sin must be burned away like chaff in the fire, he'd roar. The flesh must suffer so the spirit can soar to eternal glory. There are no shortcuts to salvation, only the narrow path of pain that leads to paradise. Their twisted doctrine resonated with the violence and unforgiving spirit of the age. Their reputation for miraculous transformations spread like wildfire. According to testimonials in frontier newspapers, hardened sinners who entered the camps emerged as new creations, as gentle as lambs and pure as mountain snow. The first crack in the facade. On a sweltering August night in 1847, the first hint of the brothers' true nature emerged. A cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell stumbled into the town of Marshall, Texas, barely clinging to life. His whispers were of a horror he'd witnessed at a redemption camp near the eerie, black waters of Caddo Lake. Hartwell, once a robust man in his 30s, was now gaunt and appeared prematurely aged. His hair had turned completely white. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he flinched violently at any unexpected sound. But it was his eyes that held the true terror. Once full of life and fire, they were now wide, empty, and devoid of light. His bright blue eyes, once full of life, were now a hollow, haunted blue, suggesting he had witnessed horrors no man should ever see. His story was a broken, fragmented narrative told between fits of uncontrollable shaking and long stretches of catatonic silence. The local pastor who took him in, William Matthews, said Hartwell would wake each night screaming about a pit of purification and a terror that never stopped. In his more lucid moments, Hartwell confessed that he had come to the camp seeking forgiveness for killing a man in a saloon fight. They said the pain would cleanse my soul, Hartwell whispered, his voice barely audible. Brother Malachi looked into my eyes and told me exactly what I'd done. Not just the killing, but things I'd never told another soul. He knew about the money I'd stolen from my mother. He knew about the woman I'd left pregnant. He knew everything. The trial of fire. Hartwell's account of the purification process was a descent into hell. Upon arrival, new penitents were stripped of everything: their clothes, their possessions, their dignity, and given rough burlap robes. Then came the confession. Brother Cornelius would sit across from you with this ledger, Hartwell recalled, his voice taking on a chilling, detached tone. He'd write down everything you said, and if he suspected you were holding back, Brother Jebodiah would use his gifts to help you remember. The confession could take days, even weeks, depending on how honest the penitent was perceived to be. But once the brothers were satisfied, the physical purification began. It started with a 7-day fast with only water. During this time, the penitent was forced to dig their own grave as a symbol of their spiritual death. The hunger was nothing compared to what came next. Hartwell trembled, his body racked with a new wave of fear. They called it the trial of fire. Beatings with leather whips that had metal fragments sewn into them. Each lash was supposed to represent a sin being scourged from your flesh. It went on for hours, sometimes days. But the beatings were only the beginning. Hartwell described ritualistic burials where penitents were lowered into the graves they had dug and covered with dirt, leaving only their faces exposed. They would remain buried for varying lengths of time, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, while the brothers prayed over them. Some of them never came back up, Hartwell whispered, his eyes wide with a remembered terror. Brother Malachi would stand over the graves and declare them perfectly purified, said they'd been called home to glory. But I saw their faces when they went under. There was no peace, only absolute terror. The most horrifying part of Hartwell's account was his description of those who didn't survive. According to him, the brothers maintained that a death during purification was the ultimate blessing, a sign that God had called the individual directly to paradise. They had a special ceremony for the ones who died, Hartwell recalled, a tremor in his voice. Brother Malachi would read from the Bible while Brother Jebodiah, covered the grave. Then they'd plan a wooden cross and add the person's name to what they called the roll of the redeemed. They said these souls were the lucky ones. They'd skip purgatory entirely, the shroud of deception. Initially, the local authorities in Marshall dismissed Hartwell's terrifying account. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man who had seen his share of violence, was skeptical. "The frontier is full of men running from something," he told Pastor Matthews. "Sounds to me like Hartwell got religion the hard way and his mind snapped under the strain. These revival preachers can get pretty enthusiastic, but murder? That's a serious accusation without proof." The Damnation brothers had impeccable credentials. They held letters of recommendation from churches across Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, along with testimonials from grateful families. No one had come forward to report a missing person. The matter was quietly dropped. Within a month, Hartwell himself had vanished. Some said he'd moved on to California. Others claimed he'd returned to Arkansas. Pastor Matthews suspected something far more sinister, but without evidence, he was powerless. The growing legend and a troubling pattern. The Damnation Family's camps continued to operate, their reputation for miraculous conversions growing with each passing season. They claimed to have saved over 1,000 souls, transforming hardened criminals into model citizens who went on to spread the gospel in the most dangerous corners of the frontier. Testimonial letters regularly appeared in newspapers, all following a remarkably consistent pattern. A desperate sinner would arrive, undergo the purification process, and emerge as a new person. Within weeks, they would feel called to missionary work in remote territories like California, Oregon, or deep into Indian Territory. Their final letters to family members spoke of an overwhelming desire to bring salvation to the unreached, often requesting financial support for their missions. But for those who looked closely, a troubling pattern was beginning to emerge. The damnation camps were always on the move, never staying in one place for more than 6 months. The brothers claimed they were following God's call to reach new sinners, but this constant migration made their activities nearly impossible to track for law enforcement agencies already stretched thin across the vast frontier. Even more disturbing were the letters families received after their wayward sons and daughters entered the camps. The letters, which were full of promises of spiritual transformation and missionary work in distant lands, were the last they would ever hear from their loved ones. The Damnation brothers always had an explanation, often with forged letters to account for their absence. One of the first to question the brothers' claims was Mrs. Eleanora Westbrook of New Orleans. Her son, Thomas, a gambling addict with mounting debts, disappeared after entering a redemption camp in 1849. She initially received a series of letters from him, describing his spiritual journey and his growing desire to spread the gospel in California. The letters contained enough personal details to convince her of their authenticity, and Thomas even requested money to support his missionary work. "At first, I was overjoyed," Mrs. Westbrook would later tell investigators. Thomas had been on a dark path, and these letters suggested he had found salvation. But something about the handwriting bothered me. It looked like Thomas's, but there were subtle differences, the way he formed certain letters, the phrases he used. I began to suspect someone was copying his style. When Mrs. Westbrook hired a private investigator to find her son in California, the results were deeply troubling. None of the churches or missions in the areas where Thomas claimed to be working had any record of him. The addresses he provided in his letters were either fake or belonged to people who had never heard of Thomas Westbrook or his missionary work. Similar stories began to emerge from across the region. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a traveling physician, had treated several survivors of the camps and began to notice a disturbing pattern in their symptoms. The mark of horrors. They exhibited signs of severe trauma, Dr. Thornton would later testify. Not the peaceful countenance of the spiritually redeemed, but the hollow stare of those who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. The few survivors who did return to civilization were indeed changed, but not in the way the brothers claimed. They spoke very little, startled at sudden noises, and seemed to carry a burden of knowledge too terrible to share. Most disturbing was their universal reluctance to discuss their time at the camps, as if they were bound by some unholy oath of silence. Dr. Thornton documented several cases that particularly troubled her. Jacob Miller, a former outlaw who survived the purification process, exhibited symptoms she had only seen in soldiers who had witnessed the worst atrocities of war. He would wake up screaming about the pit and this ceremony of ascension, she noted in her journal. When she pressed him for details, he would only say that some forms of salvation came at too high a price. Another survivor, a woman named Sarah Colby, who had sought redemption after abandoning her children, returned to her family a broken shell of her former self. She would spend hours staring at nothing. Her sister, Mary, reported. Sometimes she would whisper prayers, but they weren't normal prayers. She would ask God to forgive her for the things she had seen, not the things she had done. Perhaps the most telling case was that of Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to observe the Damnation Brothers' methods. Hawkins entered the camp as an observer, not a penitent, yet he emerged just as traumatized as any other survivor. There are forms of evil that masquerade as righteousness, Hawkins told Dr. Thornton. I went seeking inspiration for my ministry and found something that shook my faith to its core. The brothers are not servants of God. There's something else entirely, something that uses our deepest spiritual needs as weapons against us. When pressed for specifics, Hawkins refused to elaborate, claiming that speaking the truth would only endanger others. He insisted the true purpose of the camps had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with the exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. A shadow across the frontier. The pattern of mysterious disappearances and traumatized survivors continued throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s. The chaos of the Civil War provided a perfect cover for the Damnation Brothers' activities. With entire populations displaced and communication systems disrupted, it became even easier for people to vanish without explanation. However, the end of the war brought new challenges for the brothers and new opportunities for those seeking to expose their crimes. In the spring of 1879, nearly 15 years after the conflict's end, a young Texas Ranger named Captain James Morrison began to investigate reports of missing persons across East Texas. Morrison was a methodical man with a background in military intelligence, and he noticed something others had missed, a pattern of disappearances that seemed to follow the movement of the redemption camps like a shadow. Morrison had been assigned to the case after a formal complaint from Senator Charles Whitman of Louisiana, whose nephew had disappeared after entering a damnation camp near the Texas border. Unlike previous investigations, which had been conducted by local sheriffs with limited resources, Morrison had the authority and funding to conduct a comprehensive, multi-state investigation. He was about to pull back the curtain on one of the darkest chapters in American history. There's something here that doesn't add up, Morrison wrote in his initial report to Ranger headquarters in Austin. I've documented over 60 missing persons cases in the past 3 years alone, all connected to these redemption camps. That's not counting the cases from earlier years or other states where records are incomplete. Morrison's investigation led him to interview dozens of families who had lost contact with relatives after they entered the camps. The stories were chillingly similar. Loved ones would seek redemption at a damnation camp. Correspondence would continue for several weeks, describing their spiritual transformation, then abruptly cease with a final letter explaining their calling to missionary work in remote locations. The ranger's suspicions deepened when he attempted to verify these missionary claims. Letters sent to the addresses provided were invariably returned as undeliverable. Churches and missions in the territories where the converts had allegedly gone to serve had no record of their arrival. Most damning, Morrison discovered that several of the testimonial letters, supposedly written by grateful families, contained identical phrases and even identical grammatical errors. Someone is manufacturing these testimonials, Morrison concluded in a confidential memo to his superior. The question is whether we're dealing with fraud, kidnapping, or something worse. The gravedigger's confession. Morrison's breakthrough came when he encountered a man named Tobias Fletcher in a tavern in Jefferson, Texas. Fletcher was drunk and rambling, but his story was horrifyingly coherent. He claimed to have worked as a gravedigger and general laborer for the Damnation Brothers for nearly 2 years in the mid-1870s. "I thought I was helping with the Lord's work," Fletcher whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for his bottle. "Brother Malachi told me I was blessed to assist in the purification of souls, but some of those graves weren't for show. Some stayed filled permanent." According to Fletcher, his duties included not only digging the symbolic graves used in purification rituals, but also disposing of the bodies of those who had ascended during purification. The brothers maintained that these individuals had achieved such a complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. But Fletcher had seen enough bodies to know the difference between natural death and murder. The way Brother Jebodiah would work with his hands, Fletcher continued, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. He claimed it was healing, but I saw what those hands could do. He could make a man suffer for days without killing him, drawing out every bit of information about family, money, property. Fletcher described a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple murder. The brothers would extract detailed information about their victims' assets, family connections, and business dealings during the prolonged torture sessions. They would then use this information to forge correspondence with family members, often requesting money for fictional missionary work and providing plausible explanations for why the missionary couldn't return home or meet in person. The money kept coming, Fletcher revealed. Families would send funds to support their loved ones' work spreading the gospel. The brothers had it set up so the money would be forwarded through multiple intermediaries, impossible to trace back to them. Some families kept sending money for years, never knowing their sons and daughters were dead and buried in unmarked graves. When Morrison pressed Fletcher for details about the location of these graves, the man's demeanor changed completely. Terror replaced drunken bravado, and he began looking around the tavern as if expecting the Damnation Brothers to materialize from the shadows. "They got eyes everywhere," Fletcher stammered, suddenly much more sober. "People who asked too many questions about the brothers, they got a way of disappearing too. I shouldn't have said nothing. God help me. I shouldn't have said nothing." Fletcher fled the tavern that night and was never seen again. Some said he'd headed for California, while others claimed he'd been found dead in the swamps near Caddo Lake. Morrison suspected the latter, but Fletcher had provided enough information to narrow his search to a specific area near the Louisiana border where the brothers were reportedly operating their latest camp. The Rangers' resolve. The information Fletcher had provided was both valuable and deeply disturbing. Armed with this intelligence and a growing body of evidence, Morrison knew it was time to take decisive action. He assembled a small team of trusted rangers and set out for the region near Caddo Lake. The journey took them through some of the most remote and forbidding terrain in Texas. Dense forests where the canopy blocked out the sun and cypress swamps that seemed to swallow sound itself. Morrison's team consisted of 3 other rangers: Sergeant Bill Crawford, a grizzled veteran of the Indian Wars; Corporal Miguel Santos, a former vaquero with unmatched tracking skills; and Private David Thompson, a young man whose sharp eyes and steady nerves had earned him a reputation as an exceptional marksman. Each man had been chosen for his discretion as well as his skills. Morrison couldn't risk word of their investigation reaching the wrong ears. As they approached the area, the team began to notice disturbing signs. The local wildlife seemed unusually scarce. Even the insects that normally plagued travelers in the humid East Texas climate were noticeably absent. The few settlers they encountered warned them away from the area, speaking of unholy ground and cursed soil where nothing would grow properly. Ain't nothing natural about that place, warned an old trapper named Ezekiel Marsh. Been hunting these woods for 30 years, and I can tell you that land near the lake ain't right. Animals won't go near it, and the few that do come back changed, if they come back at all. Marsh's description matched reports Morrison had gathered from other sources. Multiple witnesses spoke of a section of the forest where the trees grew in strange, twisted patterns and where the normal sounds of wildlife fell silent. Some attributed this to Indian burial grounds or other supernatural causes, but Morrison suspected a more mundane and more sinister explanation. The presence of large quantities of decomposing organic matter could certainly affect the local ecosystem. The team made camp several miles from the reported location. Their plan to observe the Damnation brothers' activities before making a move. Morrison's strategy was to gather irrefutable evidence of criminal activity before confronting them. He knew that their religious credentials and reputation for good works would make it difficult to convince a jury without overwhelming proof. The sound of torment. On their first night, the Rangers heard distant sounds that confirmed their worst suspicions. Carried on the night wind from the direction of the camp came the unmistakable sounds of human suffering, screaming, pleading, and what sounded like religious chanting in languages none of them recognized. It wasn't the cry of someone in physical pain, Morrison would later write in his official report. It was the sound of a soul in absolute torment, pleading for mercy that would never come. The worst part was how it would stop abruptly, then start again hours later, as if the suffering was being deliberately prolonged. The screaming continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes accompanied by the sound of digging and what appeared to be some form of ritual ceremony. When dawn broke, Morrison and his men found the courage to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance of the area. What they discovered in the woods surrounding the camp challenged everything they thought they knew about the scope of the Damnation family's crimes. Fresh graves dotted the landscape like a macabre garden, far too many to be explained as symbolic elements of a religious ritual. Morrison counted over 60 graves that appeared to have been dug within the past year alone, each marked with a simple wooden cross bearing only a number. But it was the smell that convinced Morrison they had found something genuinely horrific. Despite the brothers' apparent efforts to manage their burial ground, the unmistakable odor of decompo, served as a battlefield medic during the Indian conflicts, confirmed Morrison's suspicions. "That's the smell of a lot of bodies, Captain," Thompson reported grimly. "Fresh ones and old ones, too. Whatever's happening here, it's been going on for a long time." As the Rangers moved closer to the camp itself, they began to hear sounds that made their blood run cold. From the largest tent came the rhythmic sound of metal striking flesh, accompanied by a man's agonized screaming and what sounded like religious incantations. The voice delivering the incantations was calm, almost conversational, creating a horrifying contrast with the obvious suffering of the victim. Morrison realized they were witnessing an active torture session, probably part of the purification process Fletcher had described. The Ranger captain faced a terrible decision: intervene immediately and risk losing the evidence needed to expose the full scope of the brothers' crimes, or allow the torture to continue while they gathered intelligence. The decision was made for him when the screaming suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow even more disturbing than the sound of suffering. Morrison knew they had just witnessed a murder, and any hope of saving that particular victim was gone. Now their priority had to be gathering evidence and preventing future atrocities. Using hand signals, Morrison deployed his men around the perimeter of the camp. What they observed over the next several hours would provide the foundation for one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in frontier history. The brothers operated with the efficiency of a well-established business, their activities following a precise schedule that suggested years of experience and refinement. The facade of faith. Morrison and his team documented a horrific routine that revealed the true nature of the Damnation Brothers operation. Each morning began with what appeared to be a legitimate religious service, complete with him singing and Bible readings. New arrivals would participate in these services, probably believing they had found genuine spiritual guidance. But as the day progressed, the facade of religious devotion would gradually give way to something far more sinister. Individual counseling sessions would begin, during which Brother Cornelius would extract detailed confessions from the penitents. These sessions often lasted for hours, and the Rangers could hear increasingly desperate pleading from inside the confession tent. Brother Cornelius has a gift for knowing exactly what people are hiding, Morrison noted in his surveillance log. But I'm beginning to suspect this divine insight comes from more earthly sources. Prolonged interrogation combined with psychological manipulation, and probably Citizen hung heavy in the humid air. Private Thompson, they had perfected a system for extracting not only confessions, but detailed information about their victims' financial assets, family connections, and anything else that might prove profitable. They would use this information to craft convincing forged correspondence with family members, often continuing these fictional relationships for months or even years after the victim's death. Morrison's team watched from the treeline, a knot of cold dread forming in each man's stomach as they observed the camp's inner workings. Private Thompson, a man whose nerves were supposedly made of steel, had positioned himself closest to the camp. He reported observing Brother Jebodiah's healing sessions, which were actually torture sessions designed to break down the victim's resistance. He's got a collection of tools that would make a Spanish inquisitor proud, Thompson whispered during one of their nightly briefings, his voice a ragged rasp. And he knows exactly how to use them to cause maximum pain without killing too quickly. The most disturbing aspect of the brothers' operation was its systematic nature. This wasn't the work of madmen. It was the chilling efficiency of a well-oiled machine. They had clearly honed their methods over many years, refining their techniques for extracting information, forging documents, and disposing of bodies. The Camp Morrison's team was obviously not their first. It showed all the signs of a well-established operation that had been repeated many times in many locations, a twisted business model built on agony and death. On the second night of their surveillance, the Rangers witnessed what the brothers called a ceremony of ascension, their chilling euphemism for murder. A penitent who had apparently undergone several days of unimaginable torture was brought to the center of the camp. Brother Malachi delivered a lengthy sermon about the blessing of spiritual purification, his voice a low, hypnotic drone. The victim, barely conscious and showing obvious signs of prolonged abuse, was then ceremonially released from earthly bonds by Brother Jebodiah. It was a performance, a perverted ritual. They're not killing in a fit of religious madness, Morrison wrote in his report. This is cold, calculated murder performed with the precision of a business transaction. The religious elements are just window dressing designed to provide psychological cover for the perpetrators and explain away the victim's disappearance. The ceremony concluded with the victim being buried in one of the numbered graves. Brother Malachi recorded the ascension in a leather-bound ledger, and the Rangers realized they were witnessing the final, mundane step in a process that had probably been repeated hundreds of times over the past 3 decades. But Morrison's team also discovered evidence that the brothers' crimes extended far beyond simple murder for profit. Hidden in the woods surrounding the camp, they found what appeared to be a workshop where documents were forged and other criminal activities planned. The brothers had clearly been involved in everything from counterfeiting currency to fraud schemes that spanned multiple states. We're not just dealing with serial killers, Morrison concluded after reviewing the evidence. We're looking at one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. These men have been using religion as a cover for every type of crime imaginable, and they've been doing it for decades. On their third day of surveillance, Morrison's team witnessed something that forced them to abandon their post and take immediate action. A family of 4, parents and 2 young children, arrived at the camp, seeking family purification for what appeared to be relatively minor moral infractions. The sight of children being led into the camp made it impossible for Morrison to wait any longer for backup or additional evidence. "I couldn't stand by and watch children become victims of these monsters," Morrison later explained. "We had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and we had a duty to protect innocent life." Morrison's plan was to arrest the brothers during their evening service when all 3 would be together and relatively exposed. However, the Rangers quickly discovered that the Damnation family was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The brothers had obviously planned for the possibility of law enforcement intervention and had prepared accordingly. When Morrison's team moved in, they found themselves facing not only the 3 brothers, but also several heavily armed accomplices who had been posing as camp workers. What followed was a vicious, hour-long gunfight that left 2 of the accomplices dead and Sergeant Crawford wounded. During the battle, the Rangers were horrified to discover that some of the camp's penitents had been so thoroughly broken by their torture that they actually tried to defend their tormentors. These victims, apparently suffering from what would later be recognized as a form of psychological conditioning, believed that attacking the brothers would result in their own damnation. "They begged us not to hurt their saviors," Private Thompson reported. "Some of them actually threw themselves between us and the brothers, convinced that we were agents of Satan trying to prevent their purification. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever witnessed." The brothers themselves proved to be formidable opponents. Brother Malachi was an excellent marksman who had obviously seen combat before, while Brother Jebodiah's massive size and strength made him dangerous even without weapons. Brother Cornelius, though physically less imposing, demonstrated an uncanny ability to manipulate people even in the midst of combat, using psychological tactics to confuse and demoralize the Rangers. The turning point came when Morrison managed to reach the tent where the brothers kept their records. Inside, he found not only detailed accounts of their crimes, but also evidence of their true identities. The Damnation name was an alias. The brothers were actually the Blackwood family, wanted for murder and fraud in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Everything about them was a lie. Morrison discovered their names, their religious credentials, their entire. The unveiling of the Damnation Family. The elaborate facade of the Damnation Family was nothing more than a meticulously woven web of lies. Their carefully crafted testimonials and staged piety weren't signs of misguided faith, but rather a chillingly clever cover for a vast criminal enterprise. These weren't religious zealots. They were career criminals who had found the perfect, sinister disguise. With their true identities and damning records now in the hands of the law, the brothers' resistance began to crumble, piece by agonizing piece. They were taken into custody one by one, yet not before Brother Cornelius made a desperate, final move. He snatched a child victim, a small pawn in his monstrous game, and held them hostage. The standoff that ensued revealed a new depth to the brothers' depravity. When the seasoned negotiator, Morrison, tried to reason for the child's release, Cornelius's response was delivered with a calm that was far more terrifying than any rage. "The child has already been marked for purification," he explained, a cold smile touching his lips. He insisted that killing the boy would be an act of mercy. "You don't understand the service we provide," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "These souls come to us broken, sinful, worthless. We grant their lives meaning by allowing them to participate in something greater than themselves. Death during purification is the highest honor we can bestow." The aftermath of darkness. It was Private Thompson who finally shattered the stillness with a perfectly placed shot, a surgical strike that wounded Brother Cornelius without harming the child. The remaining accomplices surrendered, their twisted cause finally revealed as a lost one. With the immediate threat neutralized and the brothers in custody, Morrison's team faced a task even grimmer than a manhunt. They had to uncover the full scope of the evil they had stumbled upon. What they would discover in the hours and days that followed went far beyond their worst nightmares. The brothers' meticulous, damning ledgers documented a crime spree spanning over 3 decades. These weren't simple notebooks. They were business records of pure horror. Each of the more than 400 victims was assigned a number, their personal details, the methods of their execution, and the sums of money extorted from their families all neatly cataloged. It was a cold, calculating approach to murder. As Morrison reported, they kept records like it was a business. It's the most coldly methodical approach to murder I've ever encountered. The horrific revelations. The physical evidence was even more sickening. The excavation of the numbered graves revealed the remains of nearly 200 individuals, their bodies showing unmistakable signs of prolonged, unimaginable torture. The victims range from teenagers to the elderly, men and women from every walk of life. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton and her team of forensic experts brought in from Austin and New Orleans confirmed the chilling sophistication of the brothers' methods. They had not simply tortured. They had studied human anatomy and psychology, turning cruelty into a twisted form of science. The evidence was undeniable. This was a well-organized, long-running operation of murder and depravity unlike anything they had ever encountered. The anatomy of cruelty. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton reported that the brothers' methods were deliberately constructed to maximize suffering while keeping their victims alive for as long as possible. What most horrified investigators was the discovery that the brothers had been experimenting with different forms of prolonged torture, apparently attempting to refine techniques for more effective interrogation. Some of the bodies bore evidence of multiple and varied methods of abuse inflicted over extended periods, suggesting that human agony itself had been transformed into a kind of research project. This was not simply about extracting money or information. Captain Morrison concluded in his report, "I believe these men took genuine pleasure in the suffering they caused. The religious framework they created provided both justification for their sadism and a steady supply of vulnerable victims." The clandestine workshop uncovered by Morrison's team offered further proof of the brothers' criminal versatility. Alongside forgery tools and counterfeit currency plates, investigators found stolen religious artifacts that had been repurposed as torture instruments, as well as maps indicating the locations of additional camps across the South. Yet the most disturbing discovery was a handwritten manual authored by Brother Malachi himself. This so-called guidebook outlined methods for identifying and exploiting vulnerable individuals. It contains psychological profiles of different victim types, instructions for gaining their trust, and step-by-step procedures for extracting every possible resource, emotional, financial, or physical, before their eventual death. They had reduced human exploitation to a science, Dr. Thornton remarked after reviewing the text. Every aspect of their operation was designed to maximize profit while minimizing the risk of exposure. It is a level of systematic evil that defies comprehension. The scope of their influence became undeniable once investigators examined their correspondence. Letters revealed connections to accomplices in other states, a broader network of criminals that included forgers, con men, and even corrupt law enforcement officials willing to overlook atrocities for a price. The Damnation brothers were not isolated predators. They were nodes in a sprawling web of organized crime. As news of their capture spread, authorities across the South were inundated with testimony. Families came forward with accounts of missing relatives, many linked to purification camps operated by 3 men matching the Damnation's description. Reports dated as far back as the early 1840s, each carrying the same haunting pattern. Loved ones who entered the camps continued writing letters for months or even years, describing missionary work in distant places, before correspondence abruptly ceased. One particularly striking letter arrived from Mrs. Catherine Phillips of Mobile, Alabama. She described the disappearance of her husband Samuel in 1852 after attending a so-called camp of redemption. For nearly 2 years, she received letters signed in his hand, claiming to be written from California and requesting money to fund missionary endeavors. But Samuel never returned. The machinery of deception. Mrs. Phillips's testimony was echoed by countless others. Families from Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and even the Indian Territory told nearly identical stories. Letters would arrive for months, sometimes years, detailing supposed missionary work in distant lands. Each correspondence bore familiar handwriting, personal details, and requests for financial support. The illusion of noble evangelical efforts was carefully maintained until, suddenly, the letters ceased. By then, hundreds of families had already sacrificed their savings to support loved ones who, in truth, had been murdered within days or weeks of entering the camps. A clear pattern began to emerge. Each purification camp operated for 6 to 12 months in an isolated location before vanishing overnight, leaving behind only vague rumors of successful conversions and missionaries called to distant fields. As Captain Morrison observed in his final report, the Damnation Brothers had perfected the art of exploiting the poor communication systems of the frontier. By situating their camps in remote areas and moving frequently, they made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track their activities or connect disappearances across jurisdictions. They understood the weaknesses in our system better than most lawmen, Morrison wrote. They chose locations where authorities were either overwhelmed or corrupt, and they moved on before any case could be built against them. Evidence later revealed that the brothers had also cultivated a network of protection among corrupt officials. Bribes bought them advance warnings of investigations, forged credentials, and even glowing testimonials from sheriffs, judges, and ministers who lent credibility to their fraudulent ministry. The financial scope of the fraud was staggering. Investigators estimated that the brothers had extracted more than $50,000 from victims' families through their forged missionary correspondence, a fortune in the mid-19th century, representing the life savings of hundreds of households. Yet the monetary theft paled in comparison to the psychological devastation. Entire communities were shattered when the truth emerged. Families who had taken pride in supporting what they believed to be noble missionary work were forced to confront the horrifying reality. Their loved ones had never left on evangelical journeys, but instead had perished in the brothers' camps of cruelty. The damnation case forced society to grapple with unsettling questions about the very nature of evil. Could human beings truly commit such deliberate, systematic acts of deception and brutality? The brothers' crimes provided an answer too disturbing to ignore. The trial of the century, the mounting evidence, combined with growing public outrage, ensured that the trial of the Damnation Brothers would become one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Texas history. The courthouse was filled to capacity each day, with victims' families, curious onlookers, and newspaper reporters arriving from across the South to witness justice unfold. District Attorney Robert Maxwell, tasked with leading the prosecution, faced the monumental challenge of presenting not just murders, but an entire criminal empire built on faith, fraud, and calculated cruelty. The trial of the Damnation Brothers. The prosecution faced the monumental task of presenting nearly 4 decades of crimes committed across multiple states. Many potential witnesses were already dead, and much of the case rested on the brothers' own meticulous records, ledgers that cataloged torture, fraud, and murder with chilling precision. "Gentlemen of the jury," declared District Attorney Robert Maxwell in his opening statement, "you are about to hear evidence of crimes so heinous, so systematically evil, that they challenge our very understanding of human nature. These men have masqueraded as servants of God, while in truth serving only their own lust for wealth and power. The defense, led by the prominent attorney James Worthington, attempted to soften this image. His strategy was to frame the Damnation brothers as misguided zealots rather than murderers. "My clients are guilty of excessive religious fervor," Worthington argued, "perhaps even criminal negligence. But they are not the cold-blooded killers the prosecution describes. They are men consumed by their mission to save souls, who tragically lost sight of the limits of earthly authority." That fragile defense collapsed as soon as the prosecution began introducing evidence. Survivors testified to unimaginable cruelty. Excerpts from the brothers' own records revealed systematic torture, precise financial tracking, and a cold efficiency that could not be explained away as misplaced zeal. The notion of unintentional deaths evaporated in the face of such damning detail. Most devastating of all was the testimony of Brother Malachi himself. Rather than showing remorse, he spoke with an unnerving calm and even a trace of pride. He described their operation not as a ministry, but as a service to society. "The frontier is full of broken people," Malachi told the court. "Men and women without purpose, without value, without hope. We gave their meaningless lives meaning by allowing them to contribute to something greater than themselves." When pressed to explain the torture and murders, Malachi's reply sent a shiver through the courtroom, even among seasoned reporters. "Death is inevitable for all men," he said evenly. "We simply made sure these particular deaths served a useful purpose. The money we extracted supported important work they never could have accomplished on their own." Brother Cornelius proved equally unrepentant. He described, in the detached tone of a businessman discussing strategy, his methods for extracting confessions and financial information. "People want to confess," he explained matter-of-factly. "They carry guilt that poisons their souls. They're grateful for the opportunity to unburden themselves. My gift was simply to help them do what they already longed to do." The testimonies of horror. If Brother Malachi had revealed cold calculation and Brother Cornelius a manipulator's detachment, it was Brother Jebodiah whose words most unsettled the courtroom. Speaking with the enthusiasm of a craftsman describing his tools, he detailed his methods of torture with unflinching pride. "Pain is a teacher," he declared. "It strips away pretense and reveals truth. My hands were blessed with the gift of knowing precisely how much pressure to apply and for how long to achieve the desired result." The prosecution's case was strengthened further by Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, whose expert testimony left no doubt about the calculated sophistication of the crimes. "These men were not misguided zealots," she stated firmly. "They had studied human anatomy and psychology. Their methods were designed with scientific precision to maximize suffering while prolonging life. This is the work of experts in cruelty, not religious fanatics." But it was the survivors who delivered the most devastating blows. The handful of broken men and women who had somehow lived through the Damnation brothers' purification process stood before the jury, their voices trembling, their eyes hollow with memory. Among them was Samuel Hartwell, the cattle driver whose terrified account in 1847 had first raised suspicions about the camps. Now, decades later, he appeared gaunt and haunted, every word dragging through his trauma. "They didn't just want to kill us," Hartwell whispered to the packed courtroom. "They wanted to break us, body, mind, and spirit. The torture wasn't about information. They enjoyed watching us suffer." Other survivors confirmed his testimony. Rebecca Marsh, a former prostitute who endured 3 weeks in a camp, described the brothers' relentless psychological manipulation. "They told us our suffering was holy, that pain was necessary for salvation," she explained. "They made you believe you deserved it. They made you thank them for the torment. By the time they were finished, you prayed for death and believed it would be a blessing." The most damning testimony, however, came from Jacob Wheeler, a former accomplice who had once aided the brothers in their forgery schemes before fleeing in disgust. Wheeler provided insider knowledge of their operation, the escape routes pre-planned for every camp, the exact timelines calculated for how long they could remain before suspicion grew, and the contingency plans for evading law enforcement. They had it all mapped out, Wheeler told the jury. Every camp, every move, every lie. They weren't improvising, they were running a business. And they were already planning to expand westward to California and Oregon, where the gold rush had filled the land with desperate souls. They saw opportunity everywhere misery lived. Wheeler's testimony shattered the last remnants of the defense's claim of religious zeal. The Damnation brothers had not been misguided prophets. They had been architects of organized, systematic evil. The mask torn away. Jacob Wheeler's testimony had already revealed the breadth of the brothers' ambition, but the prosecution's final revelation stunned even the most jaded observers. The men known to the world as the Damnation Family were not holy men at all, but fugitives hiding behind stolen identities. Court records from Arkansas identified them as Jacob and Cornelius Blackwood, wanted for murder and fraud since 1841. The Blackwoods had begun their criminal careers as confidence men in Little Rock, swindling merchants and wealthy travelers. Their first confirmed murder took place in 1842 when they killed a merchant who had uncovered their schemes. Rather than face justice, they fled west. Along the way, they discovered the burned remains of a church and stole the identities and credentials of dead ministers. With those papers, they fashioned new personas as the so-called Damnation Brothers, men of God whose robes concealed wolves. Everything about their supposed ministry, Prosecutor Maxwell declared, was an elaborate fabrication. They studied scripture and ritual well enough to mimic the real thing, but their faith was nothing more than a disguise, a tool for manipulation and profit. The revelation explained the inconsistencies that had puzzled investigators for decades. The brothers' strange interpretations of Christian doctrine, their refusal to cooperate with other clergy, and their constant migration from place to place. All of it was the behavior of criminals guarding fragile false identities. The final unmasking came with physical evidence. The man calling himself Jebodiah Damnation was not a brother at all. Records revealed him to be Walter Grimm, a disgraced soldier discharged from the U.S. Army during the Mexican War for acts of brutality against prisoners. Grimm had joined the Blackwoods in the late 1840s, proving so adept at inflicting pain that they folded him into their invented family identity. The truth landed like a thunderclap. What had once appeared to be a terrifying religious sect was, in fact, a criminal syndicate run under the guise of a false ministry. The verdict and sentencing. The jury required less than 3 hours to deliberate. Their verdict, guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. The weight of evidence, the ledgers, the testimony, the bodies, was overwhelming. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a stern figure seasoned by 3 decades of frontier justice, delivered his ruling with gravitas. In my 30 years on the bench, he declared, I have never encountered evil so systematic, so deliberate. Your crimes are not only murder and fraud, but an assault on the very foundations of civilized society. Jacob Blackwood, known as Brother Malachi, was sentenced to death by hanging on 17 counts of first-degree murder. His brother, Cornelius Blackwood, Brother Cornelius, received the same fate. The final reckoning. The jury's verdict brought with it the ultimate sentence. Jacob Blackwood, masquerading as Brother Malachi, was condemned to death for 17 counts of murder. Cornelius Blackwood, known as Brother Cornelius, received the same fate for 12 counts of murder along with numerous convictions for fraud and torture. Walter Grimm, Brother Jebodiah, was found guilty of 23 counts of murder, more than either of his partners, and likewise sentenced to hang. On November 15, 1882, before a crowd of more than 2,000 spectators gathered from across Texas and the surrounding states, the sentences were carried out. The execution grounds were thick with silence, broken only by the creak of the gallows. Even at the end, the men displayed no remorse. Jacob Blackwood's final words were spoken with the same cold arrogance he had shown throughout the trial. We gave meaning to meaningless lives and purpose to purposeless deaths. History will vindicate our methods, even if contemporary society lacks the vision to understand them. Walter Grimm spoke last, and his words left the crowd shivering. There are others like us out there. We were not unique. We were simply more successful than most. The frontier breeds predators, and there will always be those who know how to exploit the desperate and the damned. With that chilling proclamation, the trapdoors fell, ending the lives of three of the most notorious killers in American frontier history. The aftermath and legacy. The Damnation case marked a turning point in frontier justice. New regulations were enacted requiring greater scrutiny of religious organizations operating in remote areas. Law enforcement agencies across state lines began cooperating more closely, recognizing that isolation and poor communication had been the brothers' greatest weapons. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton transformed her experiences into one of the earliest comprehensive studies of criminal psychology. Her writings on the methods of systematic killers, their ability to identify and exploit the vulnerable, laid the groundwork for modern criminal profiling and victim advocacy programs. The financial toll of the crimes stretched far beyond the murdered victims. Families across the South who had faithfully sent money to support supposed missionary work were left destitute. Communities that had once taken pride in their evangelical contributions were devastated to learn they had funded nothing but torture and death. Captain James Morrison, whose diligence had brought the case to light, was promoted to major and placed in charge of a new multi-state task force dedicated to dismantling criminal networks that thrived across jurisdictional boundaries. His methodical approach to the damnation investigation became a model for future complex prosecutions throughout the West. Yet even as the law moved forward, the land itself seemed unwilling to forget. The sites of the camps were abandoned, left to rot in the forests and swamps of East Texas. Locals whispered that the ground was cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of those who had sought salvation but found only horror. More than a century later, travelers still speak of strange silences, ghostly lights, and a lingering presence in those forgotten clearings. Epilogue. The story of the Damnation Family forces us to confront a chilling truth. Evil does not always come in the form of madness or chaos. Sometimes it is methodical, deliberate, and disguised in the robes of righteousness. The Blackwoods remind us that within even the most civilized societies lies the potential for cruelty on a scale that defies comprehension. Epilogue. The legacy of damnation. The crimes of the Damnation brothers were not born solely from their own depravity. They thrived because the social fabric of the frontier left its most vulnerable unprotected. The brothers exploited the cracks in that system. The lack of communication between jurisdictions, the reluctance of authorities to investigate the disappearance of society's outcasts, and the widespread belief that religious endeavors were inherently virtuous. Faith, hope, and the desire for redemption, society's noblest impulses, were twisted into weapons against the very people who most needed safeguarding. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is that the Damnation brothers were not aberrations. They were products of an environment that created fertile ground for predators. The isolation of the frontier, the desperation of its people, and the weakness of its law enforcement combined to form the perfect conditions for evil to flourish. Their story remains a permanent reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness. The most dangerous predators are not those who prowl in darkness, but those who exploit our deepest spiritual and emotional needs, offering false salvation at the ultimate price. The Damnation Family claimed to offer redemption to the lost. Instead, they delivered a damnation far worse than any sin their victims had ever committed. Their true legacy lies in the unmarked graves scattered across the American frontier, a silent testament to the depths of human cruelty and the devastating cost of misplaced trust. More than a century later, their story forces us to confront timeless questions. Was this brand of systematic evil unique to the lawless frontier, or could it resurface in other forms even in our modern age? The tale of the Blackwoods, known to history as the Damnation Brothers, endures as both warning and memorial. It is a reminder that vigilance must never fade, for the greatest evils are those that disguise themselves as salvation.